Welcome to Happily Ever After is just the beginning. Keeping your relationship not just together, but happy, and we mean truly happy, is part art and part science. You've come to the right place. Here's your host, Leslie Dories.
I did an internship during my training in a domestic violence sexual assault agency. And my very, very first client ever came to me after a night of being held captive by her husband. So I'm pretty familiar with abusive relationships. And I have never seen a physically abusive relationship where there has not also been emotional abuse. But quite often, emotional abuse exists with no actual physical abuse. And a big question that many individuals face is whether their relationship has crossed the line from just a bad one to an abusive one. And unfortunately, words like abuse and narcissist get thrown around a lot these days. And relationships actually suffer because of it. So to help unpack this challenging differentiation, I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Stosny. He's a fellow relationship therapist, and he's the author of Empowered Love, Use Your Brain to Be Your Best Self and Create Your Ideal Relationship. So Dr. Stosny, thank you so much for coming back on the show and talking about what is really a confusing and difficult topic.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So in a recent piece that appeared on PsychologyToday.com called The True Standard for Love Relationships, you suggest that there's a false standard for love relationships. So what do you mean? Can you elaborate?
Well, it's just what you said in the intro. There's so much written about abuse, and I confess I was one of the early writers about it, and I've written a great deal about it myself. But it's become such an overused word that the standard of a relationship has become whether or not it's abusive, and that's a false standard because there's nobody falls in love with fantasies of just not being abused. You fall in love with fantasies of being loved, being cared for, compassion and kindness, and of giving those things. So when you make the transition into arguing about whether the relationship is abusive, it obscures the real harm, which is loss of compassion and kindness. If the relationship has compassion and kindness, it can't be abusive. And so that what you want to focus on is how to make it more compassionate and kind, not argue about what's become a negative label. In fact, you can use those words almost as slurs, and I've heard them used as slurs. You're an abuser, you're a narcissist, you're a borderline. They're calling each other names. That's really all it is.
Well, and I've had people ask me, or I've looked at it myself, and it's, what is the difference between a relationship that feels bad or that's not what you want it to be and an abusive relationship? And there are actually some terms for that, but I agree. I mean, especially now, the term narcissist is thrown around like if you want anything for yourself, you're automatically a narcissist. It's like, no. I mean, quite frankly, I think most of us want things the way we want them, and if we can get them set up that way, we're okay. But it's being aware of our impact on other people. And so I think it is really easy to put out labels. I mean, when I worked in this agency, I actually worked with a family, and the man was quite defensive about being called an abuser, even though he could acknowledge that he had hit his children and hit his wife. But once that label got stuck on it, it became really hard to reach him. And I think that may be a little bit of the problem of throwing around these labels, is that you kind of cut off effective, productive conversation, don't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My approach of dealing with abusive behavior, and I should say I don't personally treat domestic violence anymore. I started my career doing that, but I've found that if you can stop emotional abuse, it doesn't turn into domestic violence because it almost is always is preceded by emotional abuse. So I focus on that now. But when you argue about whether or not a behavior is abusive, you're losing the real point that it hurts. It doesn't matter what you call it, it hurts. So you get into this pointless argument. And in trying to reach people who are abusive, you can't confront them with your superior values. You have to appeal to their own deeper values. And in their heart, no one really wants to hurt somebody they love. And that's what you do. Are you being the partner and person you most want to be? It's your values, not mine. And then I'm just going to help you be the kind of person and partner you want to be. And that's not going to be abusive.
Well, and there really is a distinction. And I started the same place you did, started working with this, and I no longer as well work directly with domestic violence because, like you, I'm trying to keep it from getting there because by the time it gets there, lots of different problems crop up. And
a lot of harm's already been done before it gets to violence.
Absolutely. And, and I've actually had people say to me, well, at least my partner doesn't hit me. And I'm thinking, oh, my gosh, that's your standard. Which, yes, that's a good standard to have. We don't want our partners to hit us, but we also don't want to settle for less than compassionate behavior. And I know that this creates a lot of questioning and a lot of, what is that line? So can we talk about, can you explain what a truly abusive relationship looks like? Both, obviously,
I can tell you what it feels like, which is really more important. You're hurt and your partner doesn't care. That's what it feels like. They're either trying to hurt you more when you show that you're hurt, or they just don't care. They stonewall it. That's what it feels like. Now, whether or not there's a legal definition of abuse, it's very difficult with emotional abuse because you don't have a battery. And it's contextually dependent. Some things are abusive in some certain contexts that would not be in others. Like if you have a family of yellers and nobody's really hurt by the yelling, that's not abusive. But if you get someone who's very sensitive and you're yelling at them, that is abusive. So it's very context dependent, depending on the sensibilities of the parties involved. So that gets very murky when you try to go online and look for a definition of what abuse is. But I think that whole line of thinking is pointless because all that matters is that it hurts. So when they argue about whether or not it's abusive, what they're missing, one party's saying, well, you're too sensitive, and the other saying you're too insensitive. And it's like the toddler argument. One of you says it takes one to know one. And you never get anywhere. And also what I've learned, I've been doing this for like 35 years. What I started with domestic violence. In fact, first group I did was in a prison. These were severely domestic violence offenders. And this was back before the domestic violence laws really changed. You had to almost kill someone to be arrested in those days. Thank God that's changed. But
yes. By goodness,
we worked hard to change it.
Yes, we have.
But at first I found it was emotional abuse leads to that, and then resentment leads to emotional abuse, and what leads to resentment is failure of compassion. You don't have to really do anything wrong, just not be compassionate, and your partner's going to get resentful, or your children. And that's because we don't form emotional bonds without a perception that the person you're bonding with is going to care how you feel, especially when you feel bad. So failure of compassion feels like abuse. As soon as compassion declines in a relationship, resentment starts going up. And if the resentment isn't punctuated by compassion, it turns bitter, it turns cold, it turns into some form of emotional abuse. And only about 30% of the time does that then go into domestic violence. But the emotional abuse itself is hurtful. And, I've worked with a lot of victims of domestic violence in the early part of my career, and almost universally they say that the emotional abuse is worse. And sometimes
that's the experience.
Yeah,
that's the experience I had, too. They would actually say, I would rather be hit because those bruises heal. And, when I first heard that, it really shook me to the core. But it really talks about how impactful and damaging this lack of compassion, lack of connection in what is supposed to be a loving relationship truly is.
Yeah, and people don't understand how important. Compassion's the lifeblood of a relationship. It's really more important than love. You can have a decent relationship with low love and a high compassion, and you can have a hellish relationship with high love and low compassion, because the love without compassion becomes possessive, controlling, and dangerous.
Which is almost the definition of abusive as well. And this is such a hard topic, because you mentioned before, and as you were saying this, I'm thinking, this is what people grow up with. You're talking about, a family that yells and nobody's really hurt by it, because that's kind of their norm, or there may actually be compassion that kind of goes along with the yelling. I don't necessarily mean simultaneously, but both are happening, so there's kind of a counterbalance. But when that
the yelling isn't designed to hurt. It's
right.
They're not deliberately trying to devalue and demean. But if that yeller marries someone who is more sensitive, then they are going to be hurt by it, even though they're not mean. Their central nervous system isn't going to tolerate that level of intensity as well.
And that's an interesting thing, because when you were talking about somebody being too sensitive or too insensitive, I tell my clients that anytime that word "too" shows up, the T-O-O,
yes, that's right.
It's a judgment. It's like you're too needy, you're too sensitive, you're too whatever, and it's like, okay, now there's a judgment attached to that, which again isn't helpful.
Well, it's putting the problem in the partner rather than in the interaction. So you can change the interaction, you can't change the partner. My example of that is my wife has very sensitive skin, a very soft skin. I love to rub my face on her skin. But I have a heavy beard, and I can't do that unless I shave. So I have to, like when I come home, I have a heavy beard, so at the end of the day it looks like I didn't shave. I have to go in the bathroom to do a couple of strokes on my face before I can rub her cheek.
Right.
It's only one side. She doesn't care if it's symmetrical or not.
You'll take care of that this morning, right?
Now I could say that she's too sensitive, and she can say that my beard's too rough, and we never connect. Mm-hmm. But we have to figure out a way for those sensitivities to fit together. I don't want her to be hurt, and she doesn't want me not to feel connected. So that's the easiest way to do it. Couple of strokes with a razor. The challenge is to fit the sensitivities together, not criticize someone because of the difference in sensitivities.
Well, I love that. So this is Happily Ever After is just the beginning on webtalkradio.net. I'm Leslie Dories, and I'm talking with author and fellow relationship therapist Dr. Stephen Stosny about what the true standard for love relationships should be. And if you aren't in a satisfying relationship, please know that you're not alone, but how you think about it matters. And if you would like to determine if it can be better, I can help. So please get in touch with me and take advantage of your free Create Your Happily Ever After strategy session. You can reach me by email at Leslie, Lesli, at foundationscoachingnc.com. That's FOUNDATIONS, coaching, N as in Nancy, C as in Charlie.com. or you can give me a call at area code 919-924-0463. Again, that's area code 919-924-0463. Now, I want to get back to this really important conversation about what's abusive relationships, what's just not good relationships, what the solution is to either and or both. And so we were talking a little bit ago about couples getting caught in labeling undesired behavior as either abuse, narcissism, borderline personality, whatever that is. And we've been talking a little bit about why that's a problem. And so I want to go into that a little bit more with you, Dr. Stosny, about why does this matter? I mean, I know that the way in which we think about things really influences our own interpretation and our own behavior. Is that kind of an accurate assessment?
Well, of course, the way we think about things influences behavior, and the way we label things influences the way that we think about them. So that's what's wrong with these negative labels. It's really like you don't say to a child, you're a bad boy or a bad girl. Mm-hmm. Because what do bad boys do? For one thing, they do bad things. You focus on the behavior that you want to change, not on the label. So when you're labeling someone as narcissistic, the irony about that is usually when you say someone is selfish or narcissistic, what you really mean is they're not meeting your selfish needs at that moment.
Right, and it doesn't necessarily mean that what your needs are unreasonable or whatever. It just is kind of like, wait a minute.
Yeah, then you're going to go into a discussion of what is narcissism. A big part of narcissism is manipulation, and when you label someone that way, you're trying to manipulate them. So it becomes you become the very thing you're despising when you use those labels. But the real harm is that they take the focus away from what is the lifeblood of the relationship, and that's compassion and kindness. So you don't form an emotional bond with someone unless you believe that they care about how you feel. My example of that is, think of when you were falling in love with whoever it was you fell in love with, and God forbid you had to call them then with bad news, like my mother passed away last night, and I know that's especially meaningful to you. If your prospective partner had responded with, well, tough, call me when you get over it, I just want a few laughs here, would you have fallen in love with them? No, of course not. You'll only fall in love with someone who cares about how you feel. You might be mistaken about that, but you have a perception that they care about how you feel, especially when you feel bad. Even newborns who are attachment machines, your drive to form emotional bonds is never as strong in your entire life as it is the first 6 months of life. Even they won't bond with you if you don't care if you don't answer their cries with sympathy. When they get distressed, if you don't comfort them, they won't bond with you. And they stop crying, because the crying is to elicit the caring behavior. So if it's not doing that, they give up. So that's necessary in the formation of emotional bonds. And mostly what people fight about is not money, sex, jealousy, raising kids, as well as in division of labor. Those are what the people tell researchers they fight about. It's really the belief your partner doesn't care how you feel. That's what gets you so upset.
Right, and so can you define compassion? I think people have a general idea of what kindness is. I would hope. But when you talk about compassion and that being the critical component for love relationships, is that more of a feeling, or is that an action, or is it both?
It's both. It's sympathy for the hurt, distress, inconvenience, hardship of another with a motivation to help. So it's not just feeling sorry for them. You're motivated to try to help. And self-compassion is important too. When you're in pain or suffering or in hardship, you're sympathetic towards it. You're not criticizing yourself for being that way, and you're motivated to improve. Kindness is more about happiness than suffering. So it's caring about someone being well, being healthy, being happy. So your behavior is to facilitate them being well, happy, and healthy. And they're both actually necessary for relationships. See, what you fight about failure of compassion because you formed your bond at least in the assumption that there would be compassion. So failure of compassion feels like betrayal. It feels like you got me to fall in love with you by making me believe you would care how I feel, and now you don't. That's why it's so important. And all resentment, I won't say all, that's an overstatement, but a lot of resentment comes from just failure of compassion. And here's the irony. When you are resentful or when you're calling someone abusive or narcissistic or borderline or too sensitive to anything, you're doing that because you feel that they don't really get how you feel or care about how you feel. But the irony is at that moment you don't care how they feel.
That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, I don't care how you feel, but you absolutely must care how I feel. There's no planet where that's going to work.
Well, and that's the thing that I think gets a lot of people into trouble, and it's where I tend to put my focus, is that relationships are reciprocal. And what we each put into it is going to somewhat determine what we get out of it, and this is and resentment, of course, to me is the killer of relationships. But people get resentful and they suffer in silence, and they think their partner should know, and on and on. And it's like, it makes me crazy sometimes. And when a simple just doing a kind and compassionate act for your partner can completely change the dynamic. But people go, well, why should I have to do that? They're not doing it. And I'm like going, oh my gosh.
Yeah, well, I always answer that when they say, why should I have to do this? Because you want a better life. Right. If you don't want a better life, then don't do it. Well, that's sort of, if you complain to your dentist about having to floss it after every meal, he'll tell you, we'll just floss the teeth you want to keep. It's very much the same thing. Just be kind and compassionate if you want a better life.
And because, in actuality, and I think the truth of it is that when we are kind and compassionate, we feel better about ourselves.
Absolutely. That's what I always try to get to clients. Do you like yourself better being resentful to someone you love or being compassionate to someone you love? And I ask them to think about each, when you've been resentful and when you've been compassionate. And it's a no-brainer. You always feel better about yourself when you're compassionate, even if your partner's not receptive to it. You will feel better about yourself. It's better if your partner is, but the cake is the compassion, the frosting is the reaction.
Well, and what I think people don't understand is that if there's been a breach in the relationship and one of you adopts this idea of saying, okay, I get it, Dr. Stassi, I get it that being kind and compassionate makes me feel better, so I'm now going to do that. And I start doing that, and my partner doesn't immediately respond to me. It's like I throw up my hands and go, it doesn't work. But there's always a lag time between me doing a new behavior and my partner not just recognizing that it's happening, but accepting that it's real.
That's right, because most interactions in family relationships are habituated, and habits take a while to change. You need a repetition of the new behavior a certain amount of times, around 800 times usually, really form a new habit. You know, the example of that, if you go into a room and switch on the light and it's still dark because the light bulb's blown, your immediate reaction is to flip it again faster, even though you know it's because your brain's identified flipping the switch with light coming on. So it'll keep doing that even until eventually it figures out that that's not going to help. But the habit will kick in before the prefrontal cortex figures out what's wrong. And that's the way it is with new behaviors and relationships. They take a while before they have the desired effect. But the most desired effect is you like yourself better. So that's what I say to clients is that's your central nervous system trying to communicate with you. The only way it really can is to make you feel good about yourself or to make you feel bad about yourself. That's the only way it can communicate with you, and it does that very well. It's very clear. So you got to listen to it. You always choose the behavior that's going to make you feel better about yourself. Not whether you're going to feel right or justified, but whether you're going to feel better about yourself. And if you really do that, you'll be more compassionate and kind.
Well, okay, but that sort of presents to me as somewhat of a dilemma, even though intellectually and I get it, but and maybe it has to do with this idea that we give over how we feel to our partners, because it's like if the relationship makes me feel bad, then by what you're saying, there's this almost automatic, okay, let me pull away from the relationship because that will make me feel better, sort of. It just makes me not hurt as much, maybe, so stopping the pain is what I want to do. But then how does somebody switch gears into then changing it and saying, no, I've got to stay more engaged. I've got to meet what I'm seeing as pain with compassion. How does that work?
Well, the way I have it work, I work with clients to build what we call their core value. That's fidelity, what your deepest values are. And I tell them, develop that and then follow it. What that means is that you value your experience of being alive better, more, and you want to have more valuable experiences of being alive. And as you do that, you will automatically gravitate toward what builds the value of your life and away from what lowers it. Now, when both partners do that, they have a much better relationship, but if only one of them does it, they're just going to automatically drift apart.
Right.
So that's what I tell them.
Yeah, and so
don't make the judgment about the... I'm sorry, don't make the judgment about the relationship until you develop your core value.
And I like that because that's the other question that I get asked all the time is how do you know when it's just not going to work? And part of that, what I tell my clients is you do everything that you know how to do that in the perfect world makes relationships better, and then see what happens on the part of your partner, because there are some people, and who don't know how to be compassionate or choose not to be compassionate. And
there are some people who construe compassion as pity and be offended by it. You're looking down on them. So the difference between pity and compassion is pity is hierarchical. God pities us. We pity the poor and downtrodden. Where compassion is equal. We're equal human beings, and we're both frail human beings. So if you really feel bad about yourself, it can actually be hurtful to somebody's compassion to you because you think you don't deserve it, or you think they have some ulterior motive. And you can't control that. The only thing you control is being true to your own deeper values. The other person has to control how they receive it.
Right. that's also a critical component of relationships, and you know, being the best you that you can be is always going to be a determiner of what kind of relationship you're going to have, because, you know, and then the other person's going to give you information that's going to tell you whether or not this is a relationship that is one that you want to stay in.
That's right. Whether it's going to do more harm than good.
And you know, and even though, I mean, we are both relationship therapists, this is what we do. There are times when the relationship appropriately needs to come to an end, but again, usually after a whole bunch of stuff is tried, not just I'm hurting, I'm resentful, I need to get out. Taking this step and learning to develop compassion and kindness can really do a lot for a relationship.
Well, it'll heal. It's the healing emotion. It'll heal you personally. Whether it repairs the relationship depends on both of you doing it. But you have to be compassionate for your own personal healing, whether you stay in it or not. Mm-hmm. If you leave a relationship out of resentment, you're going to take it with you. It's inside of you. It goes wherever you go.
And it is quite capable of polluting the next relationship. So yeah, I agree. Let's get everybody healed, and then we can start, you know, having better relationships. Right. Well, Dr. Stasny, I want to really thank you so much for your time and for this information. And can you please tell the listeners where they can learn more?
Our website is compassionpower.com, and there's a lot of free information on there, and a lot about emotional abuse, walking on eggshells, and about how to empower a marriage that isn't abusive. Because it really, you know, what kind of blew my mind is when I found that it's really the same thing. If you increase compassion, any relationship will be better, and they can't be abusive. So that's why I moved away from focusing exclusively on abuse to focus on more on compassion and kindness.
Okay. Well, and that's a really important thing, because every relationship has ups and downs. And when you're in a low period and you're hurt by your partner, it feels awful. The goal is to make it better, not attach an unproductive label to it. And the path to a better relationship, as we've been talking about, is consistent compassion and kindness. So hopefully you'll be able to develop that, and hopefully you'll also keep listening to the show. And so until next week, stay loving.